Have you ever felt like the world was against you, like every step you took was met with ridicule and judgment? What if, in the midst of that struggle, you were part of a legacy so powerful it could change everything? In a small, quiet classroom, a student named James sat quietly at his desk. The air was thick with anticipation as the teacher, Mr. Reynolds, began the day's lesson. But today was different today. James knew he was going to be the target of Mr. Reynolds' sharp words. Mr. Reynolds was the kind of teacher who believed in tough love, the kind of teacher who thought that belittling students was the best way to motivate them. But James knew better. He had seen it time and time again. Mr. Reynolds singled him out, made jokes at his expense, and in front of the class mocked him for the smallest mistakes. It was as if Mr. Reynolds saw something in James that made him an easy target, something James couldn't quite understand. As the teacher's mocking tone filled the room, James felt a familiar sting. His face flushed red, not from embarrassment, but from a simmering anger that had built up over the years. This wasn't the first time Mr. Reynolds had humiliated him, and James knew it wouldn't be the last if things didn't change. But what Mr. Reynolds didn't know, what no one in that classroom knew, was that James was carrying something much greater than their insults. He was carrying a family legacy, one that no one could understand. And today, that legacy was about to make itself known. James straightened up in his chair, the weight of his past pushing him to respond, but he didn't. He didn't speak up, not yet. He wasn't ready to reveal the truth, not to Mr. Reynolds, and certainly not to the class. For now, he simply sat there, taking the ridicule. But with each word Mr. Reynolds spoke, the fire inside James grew stronger. It wasn't just about a teacher picking on a student. It was about something deeper, something that had been passed down through generations, a story that James had always known but never fully understood. A legacy of perseverance, of overcoming odds, and of rising above the hate and negativity that life threw at you. James's family wasn't rich. They didn't come from famous backgrounds, and they hadn't achieved great things in the traditional sense. But they had something far more powerful, a legacy of strength, of resilience, and of quiet power. A power that had been hidden, buried deep within the walls of his family's history, waiting for the right moment to rise to the surface. And today, that moment was coming. But James wasn't going to reveal everything at once. He couldn't. The time wasn't right. But it would come. And when it did, Mr. Reynolds would have to face the truth, that the young man he had so carelessly ridiculed was not just any student, he was the heir to something much greater. As the teacher continued to lecture, James couldn't help but wonder, would Mr. Reynolds ever realize the mistake he was making? Would he ever understand the power that lay just beneath the surface of James's calm exterior? Or would James have to show him, in a way no one expected, just what kind of legacy he was carrying? The answer, James knew, would come soon enough. James sat at the back of the classroom, his eyes glued to the worn pages of his textbook, though his mind was elsewhere. He wasn't the type of student who would seek attention or stir up trouble. He preferred the quiet corners, the places where he could observe and remain unnoticed. James was of average height, his skin a deep shade of brown that seemed to glow in the sunlight streaming through the classroom window. His hair was short, kept neat but not fussy, and his clothes, simple but well-maintained, spoke of a family that valued respect over extravagance. His face, though soft with youth, held an intensity, a quiet determination that others often mistook for shyness. James had learned early on to keep to himself. Growing up, he wasn't the most popular kid in school. He didn't come from a wealthy background, and his family story wasn't the kind that turned heads or caught the attention of teachers or classmates. His father worked 2 jobs. His mother took care of the household, and though they never seemed to struggle in the traditional sense, James knew they weren't living in luxury. They valued hard work, integrity, and staying grounded. But what James didn't realize as he sat quietly in that classroom was that his legacy was much more profound than he could understand at that moment. He was used to being overlooked. He had learned to be patient, to let things pass, and to take care of business without causing a fuss. But it wasn't always easy. There were days, like today, when it felt like everything was stacked against him. Mr. Reynolds, the teacher standing at the front of the room, was the one person who seemed to take the greatest pleasure in reminding James of his place. Tall, with broad shoulders and an air of authority, Mr. Reynolds had the kind of presence that commanded attention the moment he walked into a room. His graying hair, always neatly combed, and his crisp, buttoned-up shirts made him seem the picture of professionalism. Yet his demeanor was often condescending, particularly toward students like James. Mr. Reynolds had been teaching for nearly 20 years. He had seen countless students come and go, and in his eyes, many of them lacked the ambition and drive he felt was necessary to succeed in life. He saw himself as someone who had made it in life, someone who worked hard to get where he was. And, as a result, he had little patience for students who didn't meet his expectations. To him, James represented everything that was wrong with the next generation. A student who didn't speak up, who didn't demand attention, who didn't come from a background that could be considered successful in the traditional sense. In Mr. Reynolds' mind, James was one of those students who would never amount to anything. He didn't fit the mold of the ideal student, the one who raised their hand with answers, who spoke confidently, and who had a history of achievement. Every time he called on James, there was a tone of challenge, of testing. "James, can you answer this question?" Mr. Reynolds would ask, but his voice wasn't kind. It was almost as if he was daring James to get it wrong, to confirm his own prejudices. And when James gave an answer that wasn't quite right, Mr. Reynolds would smile that knowing smile, the kind that only someone with a deep sense of superiority could wear. "Well, James," he would say, "maybe next time you'll try a little harder." The words were meant to be constructive, but the sting of ridicule always lingered longer than the lesson itself. The teacher's harshness wasn't just an accident. It stemmed from his own insecurities, from a place of self-doubt masked by arrogance. Mr. Reynolds had grown up in a small town with big dreams of making it out and proving himself to the world. His parents had been hard-working but struggled financially, and he knew from a young age that the only way to rise above was through intellect and success. But as he worked his way up the ranks in education, Mr. Reynolds began to believe that his own success was proof of his superiority. The fact that he had made it was, in his mind, a clear indication that others who hadn't succeeded in the same way were simply lazy or lacking the drive. James's background, with his humble roots and quiet nature, only fueled Mr. Reynolds's sense of superiority. He didn't see a student who could rise above the odds. He saw someone who was content with mediocrity, someone who wasn't fighting hard enough for their place in the world, and that, in Mr. Reynolds' eyes, made him the perfect target for his condescending remarks. Every slight, every sarcastic comment was meant to push James into action, or so Mr. Reynolds thought. But what he didn't understand was that his words were doing the opposite. They weren't motivating James. They were slowly breaking him down, making him question his worth. The emotional stakes in the classroom were high. James, though outwardly calm, carried an internal storm. He had always been told to keep quiet, to work hard, and to never complain. But each time Mr. Reynolds made him the target of ridicule, it felt like another piece of his confidence was chipped away. What hurt more than the words themselves was the fact that no one stood up for him. His classmates, though not particularly cruel, did nothing to intervene. They simply watched in silence, aware of the power dynamic in the room, but too afraid to challenge it. For James, this classroom was more than just a place of learning. It was a battlefield. It was where his worth was constantly tested, and where he had to fight every day not to let the weight of Mr. Reynolds' words crush him. But there was something deeper that kept James going, something that fueled him in moments of doubt. What Mr. Reynolds didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that James wasn't just any student. His family, though not wealthy, had a history of overcoming adversity, of achieving greatness in their own quiet way. And one day, when the time was right, that legacy would come to light, and James would show them all just how wrong they had been about him. But for now he sat silently, absorbing the ridicule and waiting for the moment when he could rise above it all. Because James knew that the greatest strength didn't always come from outward displays of power. Sometimes it came from the quiet confidence that grew from within, a confidence that couldn't be shaken by the words of a teacher who thought he knew better. The bell rang, signaling the start of another lesson. But for James, the moment the door closed behind Mr. Reynolds, he could already feel the familiar tightening in his chest. He wasn't looking forward to today's class, not because the subject matter was difficult, but because he knew Mr. Reynolds had already decided that James would be his target for the day. James sat at the back of the room staring down at his notebook, his pen tapping absent-mindedly against the pages. He tried to focus, tried to drown out the world around him, but it was hard. Every time Mr. Reynolds' eyes flicked toward him, James knew that something was coming. The teacher had a way of making his presence known, a deliberate pause in the lesson, as he turned his gaze toward the student at the back of the room. "James," Mr. Reynolds' voice cut through the silence like a knife. The rest of the class went quiet as they all turned their heads, knowing full well what was coming next. "Can you tell us the answer to this question? I'm sure you've been paying attention," Mr. Reynolds said, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. James looked up from his notebook, his heart racing. He hadn't been paying attention, not really. The last few minutes had passed in a blur as his thoughts circled in endless loops. But he couldn't admit that. He couldn't let Mr. Reynolds see how off balance he felt. I'm not sure, Mr. Reynolds," James stammered, trying to gather his thoughts. The teacher's eyes glinted with mockery. "Oh, I see," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "James doesn't know the answer. What a surprise. Maybe if you spent more time studying and less time daydreaming, you'd actually learn something." A ripple of laughter spread through the classroom, though it wasn't loud enough to be disruptive. It was the kind of laugh that was almost more painful because it was quiet, the kind of laugh that seemed to say, "We know you're the weak link here." James felt his face flush, but he kept his gaze fixed downward, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. The last thing he needed was to be the center of attention. But no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, he couldn't stop the humiliation from creeping in. The teacher went on, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Maybe you'll learn it for next time, but who am I kidding? You'll probably forget it the moment you walk out the door." More snickers filled the room, and James felt his stomach twist. He gritted his teeth, trying to maintain his composure. He knew Mr. Reynolds was just trying to get a rise out of him, but it was working. Every word felt like a punch, each one making him feel smaller, more insignificant. But there was something else inside him, something growing stronger with each insult. A seed of anger had been planted, and it was beginning to sprout. He wasn't going to let this go on forever. As the lesson continued, the tension in the room only grew. Mr. Reynolds continued to make pointed comments, his voice always directed toward James. Maybe someone else in the class knows the answer. Anyone besides James, perhaps? James felt the weight of every word pressing down on him. He wanted to speak up, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. He felt trapped in his own silence, unable to break free. Some of his classmates exchanged glances, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. There were a few who sympathized with James, but most of them remained silent, unwilling to challenge Mr. Reynolds. They knew how he was. They knew better than to get involved. One student, Ben, a tall, athletic-looking guy who usually sat near the front, shot a quick glance at James. His eyes were filled with a mix of guilt and discomfort, but he didn't say anything. Ben was one of those students who, while not actively cruel, never stepped in when it counted. He laughed along with the others, but never stood up for anyone. There was another student, Claire, who often sat next to James. She was one of the few who seemed to genuinely care about him, but even she kept her head down during moments like this. Her silence was just as damning as the others' laughter. James had learned long ago that when it came to Mr. Reynolds, silence was often the safest choice. As the lesson dragged on, the mocking continued. James felt his body tense with each word, his frustration building with every passing minute. It wasn't just the humiliation that hurt. It was the fact that no one had the courage to speak up, to defend him. It was the fact that everyone in the room seemed to accept this as normal. He clenched his fists under the desk, his nails digging into his palms. The anger inside him was growing not just at Mr. Reynolds, but at the entire system, at the way people stood by and let this happen, at the way he had been forced into this role of the quiet, overlooked student. His mind raced with thoughts of revenge, of somehow making Mr. Reynolds understand the consequences of his actions. What if he stood up and confronted him? What if he embarrassed the teacher in front of the class the way Mr. Reynolds had done to him so many times? The idea felt satisfying, but also terrifying. James wasn't a fighter. He wasn't the type to challenge authority to make waves. But what if this was the moment? He couldn't deny the urge to lash out, to make them all see him, to make Mr. Reynolds realize just how wrong he was. He didn't care anymore about being quiet or invisible. He didn't care about following the rules if it meant staying in this place of constant ridicule. The class went on, but for James, it was as if time had slowed down. Every second felt like a lifetime. He could feel the heat of the teacher's gaze burning into the back of his head, and the low murmurs of his classmates seemed to echo in his ears. The tension was palpable, and it wasn't just in James's head. It was in the room, in the air, in the way everyone tried to avoid looking directly at him. It was in the unspoken agreement that Mr. Reynolds had the power, and they had to let him do whatever he wanted. But James couldn't take it anymore. He was close to breaking, to standing up, to showing everyone what he was made of. He didn't know exactly how it would happen, but he knew that something had to change. The weight of the situation, the constant insults, and the power imbalance in the room had become unbearable. And when the time came, James wouldn't just be the quiet student anymore. He wouldn't just take it. He would make sure everyone, including Mr. Reynolds, understood the strength that had been hidden beneath his silence. James sat in the quiet of his room, the soft light of the late afternoon streaming through the window, casting long shadows on the walls. The sounds of the bustling city outside felt distant, muffled by the weight of the moment. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tracing the edges of an old, worn photograph that sat on his desk. It was a picture of his grandfather, the man who had helped raise him and taught him everything he knew about strength and resilience. The photo was taken many years ago, black and white, showing his grandfather in a suit, standing proudly next to an old car in front of a modest but well-kept home. His eyes were sharp, filled with a quiet determination that seemed to stare directly into James's soul. There was no smile in the photo, but the expression on his grandfather's face spoke volumes, a testament to the long, hard years it had taken to build a life from the ground up. James had heard the stories countless times, stories passed down from his parents and extended family about his grandfather's struggle to make something of himself. Growing up in the segregated South, his grandfather had faced insurmountable odds. Despite the societal obstacles placed in his way because of the color of his skin, he managed to become a successful entrepreneur, opening a small but thriving auto repair shop that employed dozens of people in his community. "Your grandfather didn't take no for an answer, James," his father had told him more than once, his voice filled with pride. He had to fight for every inch of his success. People didn't think he could do it, but he proved them wrong. James could remember the nights spent sitting around the dinner table, his family telling him stories about the legacy his grandfather had left behind. The most important lesson was always the same, no matter what the world said, no matter how many times you were told you weren't good enough, you had to keep going. His grandmother, too, had her own tale of perseverance. A woman of incredible strength, she had been born into poverty, yet she had earned a degree in education at a time when few women, especially black women, were given the opportunity to do so. She had taught elementary school for over 30 years, leaving a lasting impact on hundreds of children. James had often heard his grandmother's voice in his head when he faced adversity, reminding him that education and knowledge were the keys to opening doors that others tried to keep closed. "Education is the way forward, James," his grandmother would say, her voice firm but loving. "It's the one thing they can't take away from you. No matter what they say, no matter how they try to hold you down, your mind will always be your greatest weapon." The lessons his grandparents had imparted were not just about working hard. They were about the dignity of self-respect, the value of community, and the importance of standing tall even in the face of prejudice. James had always carried those lessons with him deep in his heart, though they often felt like a burden too heavy to bear. It wasn't easy being the quiet kid who didn't fit in. It wasn't easy feeling like you were always one step behind, always overlooked. But what kept James going was the legacy of those who had come before him, people who had fought, endured, and thrived despite the obstacles placed before them. As he sat in his room, James felt the weight of his family's expectations pressing on him, the quiet determination that had been passed down through generations. It wasn't just his grandfather's success or his grandmother's accomplishments that weighed on him. It was the responsibility to uphold the legacy they had built, to prove that he was worthy of the name, worthy of their sacrifices. James turned his attention back to the photograph on his desk. He could almost hear his grandfather's voice in his mind, speaking those words of encouragement. "You have more in you than you realize, James. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." But what did that mean? How could he live up to such a legacy when he felt so small, so insignificant? How could he measure up to the giants who had walked before him when he couldn't even stand up to a teacher who mocked him every day? The truth was, James didn't know the answers yet, but he knew that his family's legacy wasn't just a collection of stories. It wasn't just something to be admired from a distance. It was a part of him, woven into the fabric of his identity. It was in the blood that ran through his veins, in the lessons his grandparents had taught him. And it was more than just an inheritance of hard work and perseverance. It was a legacy of dignity, a dignity that no one, not even Mr. Reynolds, could take away. James closed his eyes for a moment, letting the memories of his family wash over him. His thoughts drifted to a time when he had been younger, a time when his father had taken him to the auto shop where his grandfather had worked so many years ago. The smell of oil and metal had filled the air, and James had watched in awe as his father had worked alongside the older men, fixing cars and talking about the good old days. One particular moment stood out in his memory. His father had placed a wrench in his small hands and told him, "This is how we build, son. This is how we make our mark on the world, with our hands, with our minds, and with our hearts." James had no idea then what it meant, but now, looking back, he understood. It was about leaving a lasting impact, not just for yourself, but for those who would come after you. It was about building something that would endure, no matter how many obstacles stood in your way. As he sat there, holding the photograph of his grandfather, James felt a surge of resolve. He wasn't just some quiet student waiting to be ridiculed. He wasn't some passive victim of circumstance. He was a part of something much bigger than himself. He was a link in a long chain of people who had refused to be broken, refused to be silenced. And no matter how hard Mr. Reynolds tried to tear him down, James knew that he had something inside of him that no one could take away: his heritage, his pride, and the strength of the people who had come before him. The next time Mr. Reynolds tried to ridicule him, he would be ready. He would no longer be the quiet student in the back of the room. He would stand tall, just as his ancestors had done, and he would show the world exactly who he was. The following week, the atmosphere in Mr. Reynolds' class had subtly shifted. The tension between him and James was still palpable, but something had changed. It started small, a fleeting moment, when the teacher caught James's eye and then quickly looked away, as if something in his gaze made him uncomfortable. But neither of them acknowledged it. Mr. Reynolds continued to teach with his usual arrogance, and James continued to sit at the back, avoiding the ridicule as best as he could. But something was brewing beneath the surface. It all began on a Thursday morning when the classroom door opened a few minutes before the bell rang. Mr. Reynolds stood at the front of the room, chatting with a few students about an upcoming test. James, who had been staring out of the window, didn't notice at first, but the voice caught his attention. He knew that voice. It was his father's. "Ah, there he is," Mr. Reynolds said loudly enough for the class to hear, motioning toward the door. "James's father, the man himself." James turned sharply in his seat and saw his father step into the room. His father had come by the school to drop off some paperwork, something James had never known to happen before. His dad's presence in the classroom made James feel uneasy, especially given the teacher's past behavior. But this wasn't just any casual visit. Mr. Reynolds approached James's father, extending his hand with a smile. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Williams. I've heard a lot about you." James's father was a tall man, broad-shouldered and exuding quiet strength. He didn't smile in return, but gave Mr. Reynolds a firm handshake, his eyes assessing the teacher with an unspoken caution. "Well, I'm here just to check on James," his father replied, his deep voice calm but assertive. "Is everything going okay with his progress?" The teacher seemed to hesitate, his smile faltering for a second before he plastered it back on. "Oh, of course. James is a quiet student. We've been having some interesting discussions in class, haven't we, James?" James avoided his father's gaze, but he knew his father wasn't fooled by Mr. Reynolds's polished words. There was an edge to the teacher's tone, something James's father wouldn't ignore. "Quiet, you say?" His father's voice grew stern. "James is a good kid, Mr. Reynolds. He's just been dealing with a lot. Has his behavior been affecting his performance in class?" The teacher, unsure of how to proceed, stammered for a moment. No, of course not. He's very bright, just a bit shy. But, well, he has some work to do, just like everyone else." The conversation shifted, and the two men continued speaking. But James couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. It was in the way Mr. Reynolds glanced at his father, and in the way his father's presence seemed to assert some silent dominance. As if for a moment James's father had regained control of a situation that the teacher had once felt completely in charge of. Later that day, as the class was dismissed, James was preparing to leave when Mr. Reynolds stopped him at the door. His expression was different. It lacked the usual smirk, replaced by something more uncertain, maybe even apologetic. "James," Mr. Reynolds said softly, his tone surprisingly gentle, I want to apologize. I've been a bit hard on you, haven't I?" James blinked in surprise. The teacher had never said anything like that before. It wasn't a simple apology, but rather a rare moment of self-reflection. "I've learned a bit more about your family," Mr. Reynolds continued, his voice quiet and almost respectful. "And I regret the way I've treated you. You're not just any student. You come from a legacy, don't you?" James's heart skipped a beat. The mention of his family legacy caught him off guard, and he could feel a wave of heat rush to his cheeks. He had never spoken about his grandfather or grandmother to Mr. Reynolds. He hadn't mentioned the challenges his family had overcome, and yet the teacher seemed to know. James didn't speak at first, unsure of what to say. He wanted to ask how Mr. Reynolds knew, but something inside him stopped him. He had never been one to boast about his heritage, not in the way others might. But now here it was, out in the open, acknowledged in front of him. Mr. Reynolds took a deep breath, clearly struggling with his own emotions. "I don't know what I was thinking," he muttered. "I've seen your name around here before, but I didn't realize the kind of people you come from. The work your family has done in this community. It's impressive. You've got a lot to be proud of." James didn't know how to respond. Part of him wanted to reject the teacher's apology, to tell him it was too little, too late. But another part of him felt something shift inside. It wasn't just the teacher's words that had changed, it was the way he looked at James now. With a sense of recognition, almost as if he saw James not as the quiet, overlooked student anymore, but as someone with a history, a strength. "I'll do better by you, James," Mr. Reynolds continued, his voice steady but filled with regret. "I promise." For a moment, James stood in silence, processing the teacher's words. He had always been told that actions spoke louder than words, but in this case, the apology, though surprising, had some weight. There was no smirk, no mocking tone. There was just a genuine attempt to make amends. "I appreciate that," James said, his voice more confident than he'd ever allowed it to be in the past. "But it's not just about the grades, Mr. Reynolds. It's about respect." Mr. Reynolds nodded, looking slightly taken aback by the calmness in James's voice. But for the first time in a long while, James felt like he was no longer that quiet kid in the back of the room. Something inside him had shifted. He had found his voice, not just in that moment with Mr. Reynolds, but in the way he carried himself. As he walked out of the classroom, James felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't just the teacher's apology that mattered, but the fact that he had stood up for himself, that he had finally allowed the strength of his family's legacy to flow through him. He wasn't just a student to be ridiculed anymore. He wasn't just the quiet kid in the back. He was James Williams, the grandson of a man who had built his success from the ground up, and the son of a man who had raised him with strength and dignity. And no one, not even Mr. Reynolds, could take that away from him. The tension in Mr. Reynolds' classroom was almost unbearable as the final exam approached. It wasn't just the usual pre-test anxiety that hung in the air. It was something much deeper. James could feel it, and he could see it in the way his classmates shifted in their seats, eyes flickering nervously from him to Mr. Reynolds. For the past few weeks, things had been different. The teacher had softened, treating James with more respect, but there was still something unspoken between them. A lingering unease. The day of the exam arrived, and the usual routine was in place. Mr. Reynolds stood at the front of the class, lecturing on some last-minute tips and tricks to get through the test. His voice was robotic, like he was simply going through the motions. He glanced at James, who sat at his desk with a quiet but focused look on his face, and then looked away quickly, as if trying to avoid eye contact. But today, James was different. Today, he wasn't going to let things go quietly. He wasn't going to let Mr. Reynolds continue to overlook him, to treat him as nothing more than a student to ridicule. Today, he was going to make his presence known, and he was going to do it in the way that mattered most, through his actions. The test began, and the room fell silent, except for the scratching of pens on paper. But James wasn't just filling in answers. He was thinking back to all the moments when Mr. Reynolds had belittled him, to the times he had made him feel less than what he was. And with every answer he wrote, James realized that this wasn't just about a grade. It was about showing everyone in the room, including Mr. Reynolds, who he truly was. He moved through the exam with a purpose, answering each question with clarity and precision. His hand moved quickly, not hesitating, not second-guessing. The room around him seemed to fade, and all he could focus on was the test in front of him, the words, the numbers, the problems, and his mind working through each one like a well-oiled machine. Mr. Reynolds walked around the room, his eyes scanning the students' papers. He seemed to walk by James's desk, his gaze lingering for just a moment longer than usual. James noticed, but he didn't let it distract him. He kept writing, determined to finish strong. As the minutes ticked by, a few students began to finish their tests and submit them. The classroom grew quieter, and soon James was one of the last students still writing. When the bell rang, signaling the end of the exam, Mr. Reynolds called for everyone to hand in their papers. The students shuffled toward the front of the room, but James stayed seated, finishing his final answer with a firm stroke of his pen. When he stood and walked to the front of the room, there was an unmistakable weight in his step. As he placed his paper on Mr. Reynolds' desk, Their eyes met again, but this time there was no quick glance away. Mr. Reynolds looked at James, really looked at him, and for the first time the teacher seemed to understand. He seemed to grasp the depth of who James was, of what he was capable of. James turned to leave, but then he stopped. He hadn't planned to speak, but something inside him couldn't hold back. The words had been building up for weeks, months, even years. "I'm not just a quiet kid," James said, his voice calm but filled with a quiet intensity. "I'm not just someone you can make fun of and dismiss. My family has worked hard for everything we have. They've faced things you'll never understand. And I'm not here to prove anything to you. But I'm here to show you that I'm not what you think I am." There was a long pause, and for a moment the classroom was frozen in time. The other students were silent, watching with wide eyes. Mr. Reynolds didn't speak. He simply stared at James, his expression unreadable. James took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. "I don't need your approval. I don't need anyone's approval. I just need to be who I am." With those words he turned and walked out of the room. The silence that followed was deafening, and for the first time James felt like he had finally, truly been seen. Not as the quiet kid in the back of the room, not as the target of ridicule, but as someone with a legacy, with strength, and with a story that deserved to be heard. Mr. Reynolds stood there, motionless, his eyes fixed on the door that had just closed behind James. The weight of what had just been said hung heavily in the air. The teacher's mind raced as he replayed the words over and over in his head. "I'm not just a quiet kid." The realization hit him like a wave. He had underestimated James, dismissed him based on nothing but his own biases. But James wasn't just any student. He was a part of something much bigger, something far more important than the trivial classroom dynamics Mr. Reynolds had been caught up in. For the first time, Mr. Reynolds saw James for who he truly was. Not a shy, quiet student, not an easy target for mockery, but a young man with an incredible legacy. A young man who had the courage to stand up for himself when no one else would. As the bell rang again and the students began to leave, Mr. Reynolds stood frozen for a moment longer, his gaze lingering on the spot where James had been. He couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt and regret. He had failed James, failed to see his potential, and worse, had ridiculed him when he should have been encouraging him. But now, in this moment, he realized just how wrong he had been. James had left a mark on him, a mark that wouldn't soon be forgotten. In the weeks that followed, something unspoken shifted in Mr. Reynolds' classroom. The air felt different now, as if the tension that once plagued it had dissipated. James no longer felt the sting of ridicule, nor did he feel the weight of being overlooked. His teacher's demeanor had completely changed, but it wasn't just in the way he treated James. It was in the way he carried himself, in the way he interacted with the entire class. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet humility that hadn't been there before. James still kept to himself, as he always had, but there was a noticeable difference in the way he held himself. He walked a little taller now, his shoulders less slumped, his eyes more confident. He didn't feel the need to prove anything to anyone anymore. He was comfortable in his own skin, aware of his worth and the strength that ran through his veins, a strength that came from a long line of people who had faced adversity head-on and emerged victorious. Mr. Reynolds, on the other hand, began to see things through a different lens. After the day of the exam, he spent hours reflecting on James's words, on everything that had happened. He spent time researching James's family history, learning more about the achievements of his grandfather and great-grandfather, people who had built their own legacies, people who had worked tirelessly to overcome challenges and break barriers. The stories James had never shared now echoed loudly in his mind. One afternoon, as James entered the classroom to find Mr. Reynolds sitting at his desk, the teacher looked up from his papers. He caught James's eye, and for the first time there was no mockery in his gaze. There was only respect. "James," Mr. Reynolds said, his voice uncharacteristically soft, I want to apologize again for everything. I was wrong to judge you. I underestimated you, and I didn't give you the respect you deserve." James looked at him for a long moment, unsure of how to respond. But then he nodded slowly. "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds," he said, his voice steady but tinged with something deeper, something that told the teacher that James had moved past the past. He had grown, and he had learned to rise above it. "I've learned a lot from you," Mr. Reynolds continued, his voice filled with genuine humility. "You've taught me that sometimes the strongest people come from the most unexpected places, and that you can't judge someone based on what you see on the surface." James nodded again, his expression calm. He didn't need the teacher's validation anymore, but it felt good to hear it, to know that Mr. Reynolds had finally understood the truth. The class moved on, and with each passing day, James and Mr. Reynolds found a new rhythm in their relationship. The teacher became more supportive, encouraging James to use his talents and voice, not just in the classroom, but in the world beyond it. James, for his part, continued to focus on his studies, on the lessons his family had taught him, and on the future he was building for himself, a future where he would not only live up to his legacy, but also create his own. As the school year drew to a close, James stood tall, his head held high as he walked through the halls. No longer the quiet, ridiculed student, he had become a symbol of resilience. He had faced the humiliation, the doubt, and the judgment, but he had emerged stronger than ever. And in the end, it wasn't just about the apology or the change in Mr. Reynolds. It was about the fact that James had learned to believe in himself, to recognize the power of his past and how it shaped his present and future. He understood now that legacy wasn't just about the people who came before you. It was about the strength you carried within yourself, the lessons you learned, and the impact you would one day leave on the world. In the final moments of the story, as the camera pulled away, leaving James standing in the doorway of the classroom, his words echoed one last time. "I'm not just a quiet kid. I'm not just someone you can make fun of and dismiss. My family has worked hard for everything we have. They've faced things you'll never understand, and I'm not here to prove anything to you, but I'm here to show you that I'm not what you think I am." Those words, those final moments, left a lasting impression, not just on Mr. Reynolds, but on everyone who heard them. Because sometimes the strongest people come from the most unexpected places, and their past, their legacies shape who they are. But who they become is entirely up to them.